and a very warm welcome to Titanic Echoes TV with me, Mike Prince. Our guest today is the welcome return of our friend Andrew Lound, the Titanic historian, expert on all things to do with Titanic. And also today we'll be hearing about his other big subject, and that's astronomy. So Andrew, what have you got for us today?
Yes, I've been involved in lots of things, and a couple of things I'm very heavily connected with is two particular families which went onto the Titanic. One of the Davis brothers, three brothers and an uncle from West Bromwich. They were actually joining two other brothers already in the United States who'd made a good life for themselves. And in fact, the United States was desperately trying to get people from Birmingham and the Black Country to the United States because they've got skills, and they're offering all sorts of interesting deals. And these three brothers, they were going to go. Once they got settled, they were going to then send over for their families, send over for their younger brother to join them as well. And one of these brothers had been married on the Monday, and they were setting sail on the Titanic on the Wednesday. So it really set himself up for a new life. In fact, they nearly missed the train going down to London to catch the third-class Titanic Express because they mixed up the train times. And they were running down the platforms at Snow Hill Station to get the London train, and the train was actually starting to pull out. And of course, they had more than one guard on a train in those days, and lots of workers. And they opened doors and actually got the lads on the train. And they managed to get down to London, got the Titanic Express for the Wednesday morning, and made it to the Titanic. And they sent a postcard back to the family saying how they'll look forward to, once they're settled, to send back to get their families over. And as we all know, of course, tragically, the three brothers and their uncle died on the Titanic. Well, descendants of the brothers, actually, I did find still living in the Black Country. A man called John Willis, very interesting man. And with the Lester family, a lady called Mavis Whitehouse, and that was quite interesting. But it turned out that when the Titanic fund was set up then to pay for families and things like that, the parents of the Davis brothers received some money. And instead of a cash sum, they asked, could they have tickets to go to the United States to join their two other sons? So they said yes. And so they actually emigrated to the United States, where they prospered. And the youngest son did very well indeed, worked his way up, and his descendants are still there in the United States, which I'm in contact with. And they actually came over to Birmingham a few years ago when I was launching my book about Titanic and the Millions of Connections. And they were there during a major book launch and an exhibition I'd set up. So it was quite fantastic to see what had happened to that particular family, and they've been very successful. So hopefully we're going to get a link at some point with the lady and see if we can talk to her and see if she can tell us a little bit about the United States side of the family.
So could we do that interview here on Titanic Echoes?
Yes, we could. Yes. So hopefully that would be really great, wouldn't it? Of course, the other famous family which I've been researching were the Morleys and the Phillipses. Henry Morley, the famous Henry Morley with the Morley confectioners, set of brothers, often seen as a bit wide boys. They're very interesting boys indeed. But they ran a set of very successful confectionery shops in Worcester and in Birmingham. And at the turn of the century, the shops were very well known indeed. It's interesting, due to research done just recently, we actually know how they actually supplied the shops. They had outworkers of sweet makers, which was quite interesting, supplying their shops. However, they had this chain of shops, and Henry Morley he particularly ran the one at Foregate Street in Worcester. And he had a 19-year-old shop assistant there, Kate, who he decided to elope with. I mean, he was 34 years old, had a wife and child, but that wasn't going to stop him. But my colleague actually found out that his brother Arthur had already done this several years before with somebody else. So they got form. And in fact, they eloped, and it's a famous elopement onto the ship. She's 19, underage, of course, had to be 21 years old to get permission. So she was listed as 24 years old on the ship. And of course, sadly, he goes down on the ship. She survives. Turns out she's pregnant and is sent back to the United Kingdom. And she has a daughter called Ellen, who I interviewed several times. Very interesting lady, and she'd moved back to Worcester from down south. Sadly, no longer with us. But one of her descendants lives in Kidderminster, and hopefully we'll be able to get her to talk to us as well, which would be quite exciting.
Well, Andrew, I mean, I know that story about the two runaways. You know, I think of them. It's quite a famous story. But if
Mm.
you've got one of the descendants lined up, we'd love to have them here on
Yeah,
Titanic Echoes. So let's, as I know we are doing, and we've talked about this already. We'll keep in touch with you on a regular
yeah.
basis to see how we're going. So that's today's kind of real focus on Titanic and the crew members and their families on board. But let's stay in the North Atlantic on that fateful night, because as we turn to your other big subject, astronomy,
Mm.
it was a perfect night weather-wise, wasn't it? It was a great night for
Mm.
looking up at the stars.
It was a staggering night, a very unusual night in the North Atlantic. The crew and passengers commented that on that night, the stars looked much larger than normal and they couldn't see any twinkling. That's very, very unusual. That means the atmosphere was very steady indeed. And there was not a cloud, it was absolutely perfect. Dead flat calm. Stars could be seen setting on the horizon. That's very unusual because usually you see the star totally disappear before then because of the atmospheric haze. There didn't seem to be any. And stars didn't start to twinkle till they got quite low on the horizon, then twinkled, then disappeared. The stars reflected in the ocean perfectly, so it looked as if the ship was flying through space. That was the effect that they got. It was incredible. This was a good and a bad thing. It worked great for navigation. It meant, of course, they got double checks with the stars for navigation, which was absolutely superb, but there was no moon. That meant it was perfectly black. And on a night like that, what you need is extra light, because the extra light catches the ocean. It catches the wash on the side of icebergs. It can even scatter light off the iceberg itself, which is really quite important. And therefore, you would see an iceberg quite some distance away. But on this kind of perfect black night with just stars, there just wasn't enough light there to actually spot something like an iceberg or anything else for that matter coming towards them. So it actually was detrimental in that sense, which was really kind of strange. But the interesting thing about the night as well was that when people were in lifeboats, there was this claim that they could see a ship coming and going, trying to come to them, then change their mind, turn around and went back again. And what's interesting is a group of astronomers in the United States first. It was published in Sky and Telescope, which is where I got my information and double-checked their information purely from my own interest. And it was very interesting that the position of Jupiter setting matched where people thought they could see a masthead light from another ship. So they were probably actually seeing the planet Jupiter, which misled them. That in itself is quite a fascinating thought. And because Jupiter is a planet, not a star, it would actually have a disk and not a point-like source. So when that goes down towards the horizon, it just doesn't suddenly disappear out. It sort of shimmers out. So that would actually look like a ship traveling away with its masthead light. When I was doing a presentation, which we call the Starry Night to Remember about the Titanic, what I wanted to do was one of the special effects. What I wanted to do was actually show the bow of the ship moving against the stars. So the stars would actually move as the bow moved away from the iceberg. And it was quite interesting while I was doing the actual work, because there was a rumor, we have to say it was a rumor, because Lightoller apparently told his wife that when they were called to duty to try and get the lifeboat swung out, he wanted a word with the first officer, who knew William Murdoch. He knew him very well. He was quite well. And he asked him, what the heck happened? You know, what happened on the bridge? He went, oh, Hitchens got it wrong. When the officer told him, when the captain told, when he was told, we told him to throw the wheel over, he threw it the wrong way. And the ship went to one side. So we called out the instruction and they threw the wheel over again. And so the ship turned one direction and then another. When I actually built that into the animation I was doing, I could perfectly match the movement of the ship and where it was pointing at the end of the collision. So the chances are that the Hitchens did throw the wheel over the wrong way initially. And this was due to a misunderstanding of terminologies, because it's like in a rudder in a boat. If you turn the rudder, you turn it one direction, but the boat goes in opposite. And those instructions were called out. And initially the instructions used to be called out are the position you move the rudder. Now the instruction is you shout the instruction of where you actually want the bow to go. And if there was a misinterpretation of those instructions, then he would have thrown the wheel over the wrong way and the ship would have gone in the direction that they wanted. So it is quite possible that the Titanic may well have hit the berg rather than the berg hitting the ship. This is still speculation. We can't prove it because Walter Lord, apparently, when he was writing A Night to Remember, Lighthuller's widow was actually, it seems, was going to tell him this story, but he got so bogged down with all the paperwork he was doing, he never got back to her. And this would have been quite a revelation.
So this theory, Andrew, was it not brought up at the inquiries? I mean, I think you're talking about sort of discussions about this by Titanic experts like you.
Sometimes,
many years later.
It was one of these things that they didn't want to come out at the inquiry because it would suggest negligence on behalf of the crew, which, to be fair, is not. I think it's harsh because I don't think so. It's a misunderstanding, not negligence. But again, it's still speculation. We only have Lighthuller's word. He told his wife has passed the story on. So really, you wouldn't stand up in a court or any witnesses to say that is valid. And Lightoller never really discussed it afterwards. He told his wife, and it was sort of kept quiet on the grounds that, well, let's not get this out of control here. Hitchens actually survived, of course. He actually took control of one of the boats, and of course he would have been vilified. But Hitchens' life afterwards didn't go so well anyway, so whether it bothered him or not is another question at hand. But it is an interesting thought that purely because of me playing with the sky charts, tried to create an animation, it actually backed up what Lighthuller's wife Sylvia had actually told the journalist, which is quite interesting. But we'll never know for certain, of course. We'll never be certain.
This just goes to show that no matter how much you think you've read books and articles about the Titanic over the years, there's always some new aspect, some new theory that, like you've just outlined, that comes along, and you start puzzling about it and thinking, you know, the stars, what people might have thought that they saw.
That's correct. Yes, it's quite interesting when you look at that, because you even have one of the school teachers who was in a lifeboat, and he should have had better knowledge of the heavens than you would have thought, because he said you could see the stars being cut in half down the horizon. Physically impossible, it can't happen. But it gave me the idea of just how remarkable the lighting was that night. And the scattering of light on the ocean from stars is quite remarkable. And of course, that would have a big effect on what people were seeing. When you're thrown into those conditions, on a perfect conditions at night, you really, unless you're really, really sharp on you're an astronomer, you really won't know what you're looking at. And this is where we get UFO reports in the modern day when they see something, because they're not familiar with what they're looking at. And in fact, the conditions were so good that when the rescue ship Carpathia started to launch rockets to signal to the survivors that they were coming, many survivors mistook the rockets for meteors flying across the sky. Such was the clarity of the sky. So the whole conditions themselves played a major role here in people's perception. Another thing about the night, of course, standing on the deck of the ship, you don't know the ship is listing, because you actually base how you're standing by a frame of reference, the horizon. The sky was so perfect you couldn't really see the horizon properly, and therefore you'd no frame of reference. So the only time you knew the ship was listing was when you physically felt it going underneath you. By then, it's too late. And in fact, Lightoller actually pointed out that he was judging the listing of the ship by nipping down and looking at a set of circular stairs, which were crew stairs, to see the angle of the stairs as he went down them, to see how far forward he was falling. And that told him at what angle the ship was at, because you couldn't tell properly by simply standing on the deck.
Well, as always, Andrew, fascinating information, and reminding us of some of the events of that tragic night back in 1912. So now let's switch to the 21st century and another form of transport. And, you know, we keep our fingers crossed and pray that all will go well in the upcoming exploration of space, as we're talking now, I think, about the US is saying that they hope to have a trip to the moon with an astronaut and a lady on board as well. So a sort of a new crew, and getting it right, politically correct. And we also, I think, have 40 spacefaring nations looking at the exploration of space at this time. It's a very crowded scene at the moment, Andrew.
It's a very exciting time, because when we went to the moon in 1969, if anything, we got to the moon too early. We were at the very limit of what we could do with our technology. It was quite remarkable, really, that they actually did it at all. It was quite fantastic. But we were very much at the limit of our technology. It was still expensive to do. The rockets were throwaway. The only bit that came back was the tiny little capsule at the top. And what we really needed to do was get access to space, particularly low Earth orbit initially, cost effectively. And we haven't been able to do that until now. Elon Musk, with his tremendous SpaceX rocket, has been able to have a vehicle that's reusable. The space capsule itself, reusable. He's commercial. He's cut the cost of putting astronauts into space at a phenomenal rate, which NASA now just simply contract out to him to do, because they can't, the government can't do it as cheaply as SpaceX. But the spin-off with this is for hire. Any nation, and as you said, 40 nations are interested here in doing this space exploration. A country can't afford to put their own people into space, but wait a minute, let's hire SpaceX to put our astronauts into space to do our research and our experiments. And he can say, yes, absolutely, if you've got the money, you can go up. Now, this cheap cost to get into low Earth orbit has opened up the whole market. It's very similar to the early days of aviation. The first days of aviation were military. They're the only people, and governments could afford to throw money into aviation. Then suddenly somebody built a larger aircraft which could carry passengers, and suddenly private companies said, oh, that's an interesting idea. We could fly passengers, tie up with a hotel in another country, and fly passengers out, and they could go to the hotels. Well, that's the stage we've now reached here. Hotel chains are now looking at the fact that, oh, we can get into space cheaply now. Well, this is good. Very wealthy customers are quite prepared to pay several $million to go into Earth orbit for a week. So if we could build a hotel module that could attach to the space station, we could fly people up there. We could make good profits on it now because it's cheaper to get into orbit.
So am I correct, Andrew, in thinking, or I've read somewhere, that it's a Russian company or agency is actually looking at converting an old space station into a luxury hotel?
Absolutely, yes. And several designs are there already on the thing. The Russians are very keen on it. Interestingly enough, we're very doing it. And we are seeing the commercialization of space. Even space exploration is starting to look a little bit commercial now, because SpaceX have got this great system that they're going to launch rockets, but they're developing their Mars rocket. Their Mars rocket, which is loosely called, people call it Mars rocket because it will go to, it can go, the plan is it's going to go to Mars, but it actually can go to the moon as well. It can do circumlunar flights. His plan is to carry 100 people into space on these circumlunar flights. And the point is, of course, apart from paying tourists, with people with deep pockets, you know, football players probably will be able to go, but there we go. Probably the only ones who can afford it. But you'd be looking at, say, a university might go, oh, wait a minute, we could send some of our top scientists up here. There's a research program here, and it's a fraction of the cost we would be able to do this before. And because there's 100 seats on board, and you spread the cost out over the 100 seats, suddenly half a dozen scientists can suddenly find themselves affordable to do some research. Suddenly, space is opened up wider than it's ever been before. And we've got so many nations now. Again, we've got the United Arab Emirates sending a space probe to Mars. China, of course, always want to get in there. China are interested in the economics of space, very much so. They've got a good rover on the moon, and they're certainly looking at mineral rights and things like that. So you are looking at mining the moon. One of the great films, of course, which came out was Moon 02. Many people remember it. Very tongue-in-cheek, made by the Jerry Anderson and Sylvia Anderson family. What's interesting about that film, it was very tongue-in-cheek, looking at miners working on the moon, commercial space flights. We're actually about 10 years away from that movie now. I've been able to do that. And that's, you know, you're going out, you're prospecting on the moon, laying your claim, I want this area. There's going to have to be new legislation, of course. There's going to be new laws have to be passed internationally, because we have actually reached that fantastic point now where space exploration and flying into space is now going to be an everyday occurrence. A matter of fact, in 10 years, you're certainly going to see the first private companies, I do believe, starting to seriously look at mineral access and what we call rare earth metals, which is the things you've got in your mobile phone to make them work. Well, they're running out on the Earth, but they're on the moon. So
now, Andrew, here's a question from one of my grandchildren. Who owns the moon?
Nobody. It's a very good question, and out of young people comes the sensible question. Nobody owns it. The Americans never claimed that section of the moon when they landed. The statement was made: "We came in peace for all mankind." So the international law states that no nation can claim a heavenly body or part thereof. And that is international law. This is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is way out of date now. It really desperately needs updating, because there's no question that when China start putting humans on the moon, and they've already said they want to do that by 2030, a bit later perhaps, there's no doubt in my mind that they will ring an area off and put a flag there and go, "This is ours."
That was the next question, in fact. Will nations respect it, the law?
Yeah, they'll take that. I mean, nations like China will just claim sections and say, "Wait a minute, the mineral rights are ours." But you've got to have an interesting system there, thanks to Elon Musk. The private companies are going to say, "Well, wait a minute, there's mineral opportunities here." Take a company like Rio Tinto Zinc. Their specialism is metals. Digging out the earth, getting the materials they need. They're going to go, "Well, there could be stuff on the moon we want." They're a big company. They can afford to send prospecting teams, either robotics initially, and then possibly people to actually retrieve stuff from the moon. Are they going to land on the moon and say, "Oh, well, we'll agree to international agreements"? No, we want to negotiate this section of the moon for mining. So the world is going to have to get together now and negotiate this, because you could end up like the Wild West, where everybody just flies off as far as they can go and just grabbing and stakeholding it, which is how the United States developed, of course. People just raced out there, put the flags in the ground, grabbed the bits of land, and then said, "This is ours." And years later, the United States was formed to create federal states to actually somehow grab it all together and pull it together.
That's like the famous Oklahoma land grab, wasn't it? When all the horses lined up and off they went.
Yeah.
So,
this is
what we're talking about, Andrew, is that there's got to be, and we must hand it over to the politicians, a huge amount of goodwill and common sense and, well, civility going forward.
Yeah, there's going to have to be some hard negotiation here for people to get into agreements. We're already looking at the possibility that weapons, defensive systems are going into space, because, of course, if you're sending people into space on the moon, say American prospectors go out there, well, who protects them? Who polices the moon? Supposing people land on the moon and somebody commits a murder, who has jurisdiction to prosecute that person? You've got all these situations that now have to be dealt with, and it's very much like the early days. It's very exciting, but I think the United Nations need to get a grip on this, and the nations need to be pulled together, almost like some of the other films that came out in the 50s, strangely, where you had almost the United Nations running the world space program. And I think you need a world governing body now to start to say, "Hey, we really do need to have a proper structure here." There is, to a certain degree. I mean, to be fair, there is a little bit, but many countries, China, for instance, and Iran, sometimes ignore the rules and do their own thing. Everyone's supposed to lodge, for instance, when they're going to launch a satellite, what orbit it's going into to make sure they don't collide with anything else. Well, North Korea just goes and does it.
Well, let's hope, as really alluded to a few moments ago, that all these countries, some of the countries you've just mentioned, will actually sit down and everyone talks together. That's our big hope for space exploration. And I'd like to come back to you on this in one of our next interviews to talk about the United Nations of space, Andrew, because you're very tuned into all that's going on. And I think some of our viewers will appreciate more details or more thoughts as to how that's going. We're kind of out of time now. So, Andrew, thank you very much indeed for all that you've given to us today, and thoughts and information. And we really look forward to the possibility, and I think it's a strong possibility that you've mentioned, meeting the runaways, that runaway couple, and also those brothers, the crew members, to meet some of their descendants. So that's on the menu here at Titanic Echoes very soon. So once again, Andrew, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And to everyone at home watching, thank you for being with us on Titanic Echoes. And we'll see you soon. And now my signature look at the bottom of the screen to say it's time to press that button. Take care. See you soon.